This is the episode we've been waiting for. It really pushes the story forwards, and now it's time to break down the 6 key takeaways from The Mandalorian Episode 7 or Chapter 23. But brace yourselves, guys, because I think this episode is deceiving. There's way more to it than meets the eye. Let's break down what we got, weed out the truth of what's really going down here, and speculate on what's going to happen in the last episode. So to kick things off, I have to give a green box to story. The story really pushed forwards in this episode. We got the different Mandalorian groups uniting with the Children of the Watch and Bo-Katan's Night Owls. Now these are groups that, it was said in the episode, they've never met before and they know very little about each other, but what they do know about each other they hate. So there was always bound to be some friction, and we do see that boil over at times. We get some very tense moments between the two groups when they're facing off against one another, not saying a word, and you can't really gauge what the Children of the Watch are thinking at that time because their faces are covered with the helmets. And you do see it boil over in Axe Woves and Paz Vizsla, two of the most respected leaders in the two groups. Axe Woves, let's not forget, was leading the Night Owls up until the last episode, and Paz Vizsla was always around with the Children of the Watch. He was very much the Armourer's second in command. They get a bit heated over a board game, but really what that boils down to is the tensions between the two groups. It wasn't really much to do with the board game, I don't think. We see the two groups then unite together, reluctantly I think, to return to Mandalore. This is the moment we've been waiting for all season, and it finally comes down to it in this episode. They return to Mandalore, but they've got a surprise in store for them. On the way down to the planet, and as they settle on the planet, Bo-Katan reveals the truth about what happened with her and the Darksaber. This is something we've been wondering for a long time, and it turns out that, in the Purge, she voluntarily gave Moff Gideon the Darksaber, and she surrendered to Moff Gideon to spare the lives of her people, to save what was left, rather than to fight until Mandalore was no more. Now, this is a big reveal, not just for Bo-Katan, but for all the Mandalorians. Some of them may not exactly know what went down there. And with the Mandalorians' warrior culture, and they're very much still like that, that's a big reveal for them to then find out that their leader voluntarily surrendered. A lot of them would have fought to the death. So even though for us, it kind of makes sense, for Mandalorians, they likely don't see it that way. And Bo-Katan was very ashamed of herself when she was telling others of that reveal, but I think it was much needed. If her rule is going to be successful this time around, she can't build it on the failures of the last time. And there's also something here that I want to mention as well, which is in regards to the opening scene, one of the opening scenes with Moff Gideon, when he's in his Imperial base. These tanks behind him, are they cloning tanks? Are the experiments still ongoing to create Snoke or perhaps another powerful being? Wasn't mentioned, but it kind of floated around in the background there that I picked up on. Now, the second box today is going to be another green box, and that is for the Imperial plan. All along, we've been led to believe that these are Imperial remnants. They're scattered across the galaxy. And I believed it myself, and I'm sure many of you did as well. Then they're a little bit dysfunctional. Some of them are doing one thing in different parts of the galaxy. Some of them are doing others. Well, this isn't the case at all. They have something in place called the Shadow Council, where all these different remnants are working together. It's just under wraps, and they appear on the surface as very divided, very split up, and very depleted, but it's not the case at all. They are working together, and the Empire and their collective power is still in the galaxy, and it's much more prominent and powerful than we ever anticipated. So we get that reveal in this episode, but what's more, we learn that Moff Gideon's main base is actually on Mandalore, of all places. That's absolutely crazy. We learn a little bit about his overall plan and the Empire's overall plan for the future, which I do think is driven heavily by Moff Gideon. Although he mentions in the episode that the clones weren't his idea, he is picking out the best parts or the most important parts of recent galactic history and tying them in together. So he's already part of the Empire, and that was of course a big moment in the galaxy. But he's also looking back at the clone troopers and the idea of them with the Kaminoans. He's looking at how significant the Jedi were in recent history, and also the Mandalorians, and he wants to combine all the best parts of each of them cultures, and whatever you want to call them, together for the future of the Empire. So to me, that spells out Kaminoans, clones, Jedi, Mandalorians, Beskar. That is really, what their culture is about. You know, the Beskar is their most powerful ally, like the Jedi have the Force. So really you're gonna look towards Moff Gideon potentially creating an army of clones, an army of Force-sensitive clones that wear Beskar, which sounds pretty dope in my opinion. Whether he will actually get to that stage or not is yet to be seen, but that's what he's going for. So let's move on now to box number 3, and that is going to be for Grogu. I did say, I think it was in last week's breakdown or one of the videos, that Grogu hasn't really had much development this season. Like Din Djarin, you know, it's more been about Bo-Katan and what's going on with her and her journey back to the top. Well, this episode did change that. We'd actually got Grogu pushed forwards now, more into the spotlight to take more of a prominent role going forwards. In this episode, he does appear much closer to Bo. In the opening scene, I believe, when they're on their ships and they're arriving on Navarro, you know, with the Night Owls, Grogu isn't, you know, to the side or just behind her in his pod. He's actually sitting on her lap now as she's driving the ship, whereas Din Djarin's in the background. He does get the IG-11 made into a suit for him by the Azellans, and it's kind of like your Iron Man-y kind of suit where he's inside and he's controlling it, and it's now called IG-12, and this is going to make him much more of a threat going forwards once he works out the controls, and he now has a way to communicate before he can actually talk. I don't know why he can't talk right now, but maybe we'll see an actual word in the season final, who knows. Now, it does bring more of a role for Grogu, and it really pushes that character forwards in terms of what they're capable of, and the importance of the role they can have going forwards as well. I mean, I just have to wonder, what would Luke Skywalker make of that if he saw it? It's very different to having the Jedi robes and a lightsaber, that's for sure. Now, box number 4, and this has got to be a green box as well. I mean, this is a really positive episode, guys, and I think a lot of you feel the same way, and this is going to be for the future. Now, this episode did do a lot to serve what's going to come in the future. Some of it we already know, some of it we don't. Now, we've got the pirates mentioned, and it's confirmed in this episode that the pirates were actually sent to Navarro as part of Moff Gideon's plan to take over the planet, but that plan was foiled by the Mandalorians. So we know that Vane escaped. You know, he kind of abandoned Gorian Shard and went his own way. He was very much for hire. But it has been confirmed now that he is going to be appearing in the Skeleton Crew. So that is a way that they're going to tie in all of these stories, potentially with Vane and with the bigger story that's on the horizon as well, which is going to be Thrawn, which is heavily mentioned in this episode of The Mandalorian. Now, the Ahsoka trailer coming out a few days ago completely makes sense to me to get that back of the head reveal from Thrawn and front of the face reveal as well, if you know where you're looking. To have him mentioned so heavily in this episode, it just ties in that whole idea as well, and potentially could open the door for maybe a few characters from the Ahsoka show to make an early appearance in this season of The Mandalorian, which we'll talk about in a moment. Now, if we look a little bit further past what's going to happen in the Ahsoka show and these Mandoverse shows and look towards the sequels, we actually got an introduction of the Praetorian Guards, and I have to say, the Praetorian Guards in this episode looked so good. They looked sick. Much better than what they were in The Last Jedi, in my opinion. They were cool in The Last Jedi, but they looked so much better in The Mandalorian. They looked more mysterious. They did have a different helmet, more of a Mando-style helmet, but it was definitely the Praetorian Guards. Now, that they got sent to Gideon by another part of the Empire. He requested them and they sent him over to him. So maybe this other part of the Empire is dealing with the Snoke cloning and that side of things. Maybe that is where Snoke is being hatched out of right now, but the potential for Snoke or what's going to come there in the future. And maybe Gideon is so focused at the moment on making what we spoke about earlier, maybe an army of Force-sensitive clones that wear Beskar. That's where I see this going. Now, box number 5 today, and I know a lot of you in the comments in my last video weren't too happy with this reveal. You know, not because you didn't think it was a good reveal, but because it was a bit sad for you. You've grown to like this character, and this was Paz Vizsla's sacrifice. Now, this did kind of remind me of Opie and the way he went out in the Sons of Anarchy. He was killed, of course. Paz was by the Praetorian Guards, which just shows you how much of a threat they are. They got took apart pretty easily by Rey and Kylo Ren in the sequels. Paz Vizsla's a big guy. He can handle himself. He took out a load of normal troopers. 3 Praetorians come up on him and he falls pretty quickly. So it just shows you how dangerous these guys are, and it adds more of a threat to them individuals going forwards. And because Paz Vizsla died, none of the other Mandalorians know that the Praetorian Guards are there on that base as well and what they're truly capable of. But what I will say, one positive note, is it isn't the end of the line for House Vizsla. Of course, we have Ragnar Vizsla, Paz Vizsla's son. He left. He didn't go with them to Mandalore. He's still back on Navarro, I believe. So he's still alive and well. So the Vizsla bloodline will carry on in Ragnar. And regardless on how this goes down in the future, I do think Mandalore will be retaken by the Mandalorians. But none of this would have been possible, I don't think, without Paz Vizsla's sacrifice in this episode. Now, box number 6, and this is an interesting one. This is more of a theory, but I think a lot of people are thinking it as well, is the armourer. Is she actually on Gideon's side? Have you noticed how similar their helmets are, even with the horns on top? The armourer's is gold, and Gideon's is black. Now, Gideon mentions in this episode that his plan to bring all the Mandalorians there together in one place so he can wipe them out once and for all has come around, and it's worked out pretty well so far. Well, we have to think, who gave Bo that motivation to reunite all the Mandalorian factions and retake Mandalore? It was the armourer, who disappeared just before things went south for the Mandalorians, and she took the others back to the ship. It was the armourer. I don't think this is a coincidence. I think Gideon's got his own plans that go above the plans of the Empire and what we think on the surface. I think Gideon's got something else going on with Mandalore and his own objectives at this point. He didn't seem too keen on Thrawn's return either. So I think Gideon's up to something, and I don't think the Empire knows about it. Now, Giancarlo Esposito did mention in a recent interview about Gideon bait and switching. Maybe this could be it. Now, overall, I think this episode was really good. I will give it a solid 9 out of 10 in my opinion, and that is the highest ranked episode I've gave of this season so far. Now, I am more forgiving of previous episodes at this point in time. The ones that did have very little story development and you was kind of going on a side quest. I mean, that typically does happen for all the seasons of The Mandalorian, but you think, well, with all these shows coming up in the future now, with Ahsoka coming out in the summer and then Skeleton Crew, you've really got to start pushing this story forwards and building up towards the bigger picture. We didn't get much of that this season, but this episode we did, and you can kind of spot now the little breadcrumbs that were scattered around amongst the other episodes, hidden in the details, that really helps build the story forward to what's going to come in, I think, which is going to be a really good season final. Now let's talk a little bit about what we think is going to happen in the next episode, and this is going to be a big one, I think. I think there's a lot of similarities this time around, as there was to Season 2. Someone's taken. Last time it was Grogu, this time it's Din Djarin. The Mandalorians are very much on the ropes at this point in time, as they were in the last episode. Why did Gideon take Din? Hopefully we find that out as well. Are we going to get more reveals from what Din finds out going behind the scenes with the Empire and being in that interrogation room? Most likely going to be questioned by Moff Gideon himself. I mean, what could Moff Gideon possibly want from Din Djarin at this point? He knows now where Grogu is, if it is to carry on his experiments. You know, he didn't put that out of the picture altogether. He did mention this episode that, you know, the work is lost for now, but, you know, it can come back in the future. Is it to find out Luke's location? Does he realise that if the Empire's going to rise again, Luke Skywalker's going to be a huge threat for him? And he assumes that Din Djarin knows where he is, or he knows some clues that might point him in the right direction, as he's now back with Grogu, and Grogu went with Luke Skywalker in the end of Season 2. And then you have to ask the question of who's going to rush in to save the day? If they are going to follow on the Season 2 format, yeah, because it did do really well, who's going to come in and save the day at the last minute? You know, it could be the Mythosaur, and I do think the Mythosaur will be playing a part in the season final. I think they will rise up and they will be a big help to the Mandalorians as they are on the ropes, but I think someone else is going to come in as well. I would really personally like Boba Fett to come in, but I can't see that happening. You know, they can't get any signals away out of the atmosphere at the moment, so how are they going to contact Boba Fett on Tatooine? I don't think that's going to happen. But then there's also the possibility that perhaps Grogu could contact Luke. He could reach out to Luke using the Force. Now that would make me very excited. Or even Ahsoka, you know, they've spent a little bit of time together as well, it seems. And maybe Ahsoka could arrive with someone from Rebels to really tie in that Ahsoka series coming out in August. Guys, I'm buzzing off this episode. Let me know what you think about it in the comments. Remember to leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed it, and remember to subscribe if you're new. I'll catch you in the next one. This is the way.